Hello, everyone. We are going to be going over different positions within clinical research and a little overview of just general clinical research terms. I think this will be useful for people to get an idea of what positions are out there, how when you're looking for jobs, which position is above what one, which one's a little bit more entry level, and kind of different approaches trying to get into research. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe give me a thumbs up. That's good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So Power of Work is a nonprofit where we try to provide a training platform in the sense of training support. And we do this right now via YouTube videos and just trying to work with people one-on-one. And they're trying to secure employment within clinical research. So do this by job hunting, trainings, teaching skills like this kind of presentation, resume review and cover letter review. We do something where we build job charts. So you tell us what kind of jobs you're interested in, and we'll try to put together a little chart for you. And then we also do like mock interviews. I think those are extremely helpful because a lot of times people think they're ready for an interview, but it really takes going through multiple rounds of practice to really nail it. And then the goal eventually is to create a supportive community that then helps the next round of people. And we have seen this. We have a good handful of people who have not only gotten jobs, but now it's been like a year or so, and now they're all on to like the next level of jobs, which is really exciting. And these are future contacts for all of us, not only me, but all of you guys looking into Power of Work. And so we can slowly broaden our network that way. So high-level clinical research, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So these are experiments done on human subjects, and these are participants or volunteers. So that's kind of their title and how we would refer to them. And the main endpoint is to determine the safety and efficacy of the drug, which we call the investigational product. And then why is this important? Basically, it determines the safety and effectiveness of the drug, but also provides the ability for people to actually get new medication, right? So medication is expensive to run trials on, and that's why it tends to be expensive. The studies that I work on right now are, multiple millions of dollars that go in to just running one phase of the study. And then there's tons of money and research that is done prior to that. So before it gets to a human stage, you're in the lab. A lot of times a company will buy a molecule from somebody, maybe like a research institution, like let's say Harvard or Johns Hopkins, and they might be in their labs doing some research, and then they will partner and basically let the company run the studies and continue to do preclinical studies, so more lab studies from the company. And then, and we'll go over, if we have time today, the different phases of studies. But the idea is that overall, if we don't run clinical trials, there are no new medications, right? So if you think about antibiotics, we have several types of antibiotics. We're not rapidly making more antibiotics. There has been a lot of research and effort on that. We have not found new antibiotics, so we can become antibiotic resistance, right? The bacteria, and that's a problem. So research needs to continue, and while it's expensive, a lot of times the companies will run multiple different studies trying to make a drug, and let's say a couple of them will fail. They won't be as good as they thought, but then one will succeed, and that one now needs to pay for like all of them and future research. I kind of wanted to bring that up because a lot of times people talk about how expensive clinical trials are, and that's because, and how expensive medicines are, but that has to do a lot with all these different people, and we'll talk about this today, all the different roles that are involved in a clinical study. So just some, again, high level, just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're talking about a CRO is the contract research organization, and basically it's a company that helps the sponsor, and they usually are focused a lot on the monitoring and managing the CRAs, but they can also do other things. So they can do the TMF, and they can do other, sometimes they do regulatory, they do safety if needed. The sponsor, whereas, is the company who takes responsibility for and initiates the clinical investigation. And I think of them as kind of like the owners of the drug. So a company, biotech company, has bought a drug or created in their own lab a drug, and they now want to test it and see if it's going to do what they hope it's going to do, and hopefully help people's lives be better, right? And so that sponsor can contract a CRO to work for them. And so you can have a TMF CRO, you can have kind of like a CRA monitoring CRO, which is the more common one. And then any other needs you have, the CRO usually can do it. But because the sponsor is responsible at the end of the day, they have to have oversight, which is very important, for all these different activities. So a lot of times, if the sponsor can afford it and they can do it well, you want to bring things in-house as much as possible, and then use your contract research organization to help you support you in different aspects. So, like I mentioned, the most common is for the CRAs, which are the monitors, people who go out to the sites, and we'll talk about that more. But usually you have a whole team of them, and they have to have a lot of instructions and checklists, and they have to know what they're doing. And then the CRO can also be useful for helping select the sites. So sites are where the actual drug or device or whatever you're trying to do is being tested on humans, right? So the sponsor does not see people. The sponsor hires and organizes different institutions, such as usually universities, or like the Mayo Clinic is not a university, it's just a really highly regarded clinic. Dana-Farber is another one that's known for their cancer research. So you can have big hospitals and institutions like Kaiser. So it doesn't have to be actually associated with a hospital, or sorry, with a like a university, but a lot of times it is, right? Universities are more inclined to do research. And so, you have Stanford and Harvard and a lot of other big universities who do a lot of research. And so they will run studies. They are usually what's called a teaching hospital. And so they will see people, but they also have their own University of Medical students performing procedures on patients, right? Or like, with the assistance of a head doctor. And then the actual studies being done are usually not done with like the medical students. These are just the high up doctors who will run a study. And we'll go kind of a little bit into that later. But that's an idea of that's a site. So a site is where people are being seen. And then the data from the sites get entered into kind of a big network of data. So it's usually they fill out forms called CRF, clinical research form, and they enter that into a database, usually called, there's like metadata is the common one. So all this information goes into that, and then that data is used by the sponsor, the people who own the drug, to get the FDA approval of the drug. Another important term to know, just so that you're not lost as we go through all of this, is the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board. And they play an important role in making sure that patients are protected and they are safe. And a lot of times, if something goes on that doesn't feel good, the IRB has the ability to say, no, we're out of this, in a sense. We no longer want to run the study at our institution. So usually, like, Stanford will have their own IRB. Now, there's something called a central IRB, which is when Advera is one of them. It's a large organization that kind of helps facilitate, because it takes a lot of effort on the sponsor side to set everything up. And so to kind of streamline clinical research and to make research cheaper so that the drugs in the end for the patient can be cheaper, one kind of solution is to try to streamline things such as having a central IRB. So a lot of times the sites are in charge of whether or not they like to do a central IRB. They'll usually have their own IRB, but if the study, the sponsor is saying, hey, for our study, we really want to use the central IRB, and the site feels like they can trust it and they are okay with it, then that streamlines all of the processes and makes things a lot easier for everybody. Sometimes the site says, no, we have our own IRB. We prefer to have our own setup, and that's just what we have to do. Okay, and then one last term that I wanted to go over is GCP, good clinical practice, is a set of rules and regulations that helps the safety and integrity of the clinical trials. There is a separate presentation on this, and we are totally happy to go into this further in the future. There is a great free GCP training that I recommend, so please reach out to me if you ever have any questions about that, and we can go through that. But it is really important that everybody who's involved in clinical practice knows good clinical practice here, has a basic understanding of all the different rules. Okay, so the meat of what we want to talk about today is the positions within clinical research. Now, I have on a couple other slides going into each of these, but I think I will just mainly stay on this slide and work through it and kind of give you my understanding of each of these rules, and then I might highlight people that we know or videos that we've already done that you can watch to get a little bit better understanding of it. So, principal investigators. So those are what we talked about, the head doctors at the site, right? So this is the doctor at Stanford, the doctor at Harvard, the doctor at Mayo Clinic. They're each their own principal investigator. So they are the head person running the study on the site. They are the ones organizing and responsible for the care of the people that are being seen with the drug. So while there is the protocol, which are the instructions for how the sponsor wants the study to be run, the principal investigator always needs to first protect the patient's safety and rights. So if there's anything that goes on medically, they medically need to take care of their patient, regardless of the protocol. Now, if they deviate from the protocol, which is like, for example, giving the drug and certain medications to the patients, right? So the protocol will say they shouldn't have X, Y, and Z other medications going on. But if something else happens, and for example, it can be completely irrelevant to the study, but their patient who they are treating has some sort of reaction to something else or gets hospitalized for something else, they are in charge of making sure that they get what they need and they're safe. And that sometimes means violating the protocol by giving them the medication that the protocol says we don't want our study participants to have, right? Because it might influence the drug. But the safety of the patient always comes first. So a lot of times if that happens, there's a protocol deviation, or the patient has to go off the study because they've now had this medication that will conflict and kind of mess up the data on the study, and so the patient can no longer participate in the study. And we'll go into further things about kind of extension studies and patients staying on studies because they can get the drug, and making sure they still get good treatment. But overall, the principal investigator is the head of the site who's seeing the patient and responsible for the care of their patient. Now, the way it works is you have the investigator, and then you have sub-investigators. So these are the other doctors on the study and at the site. And all of their information needs to get collected and organized just like the principal investigator. So per the different videos that you've probably already seen, you collect different documents. So on the 1572 will be the principal investigator, the sub-investigators, a whole bunch of other information. And then you need to make sure you collect different trainings and medical licenses and everything for both the principal investigator and the sub-investigator. There's a delegation of authority log, which usually the principal investigator fills out to say, while I am responsible for everything, I have delegated different responsibilities to different people, usually the sub-Is. Or as we'll see, like it could be the clinical research coordinator or different research nurses on their staff who could be the one to give out the drug. But at the end of the day, the principal investigator is the one who's responsible. Just like overall, the sponsor is responsible for this, the whole study, right? Principal investigator is responsible for the study at their site. So you have a whole group of people that support the principal investigator. So we talked about the sub-I, but then you also have clinical research nurse, you also have the pharmacist at the site, and the clinical research coordinators. And the clinical research nurse could be the clinical research coordinator. Sometimes the clinical research coordinators have nursing degrees, and so the titles can be different. So I wanted to highlight that a lot of times different titles will kind of overlap between different positions. Now, the one thing that's important about the pharmacist is that there's an aspect of all the drug that comes in and all the drug that kind of gets then distributed per patient. And so that usually is called your IMP. And so we talked about investigational product. And there is a whole aspect of reconciling this. A lot of times that's what their CRA will do on the sponsor side. So the sponsor hires somebody called a CRA that comes out and monitors. And that's over here on this side of the chart that shows the people who don't deal directly with the patients. So the clinical research associate makes sure and works with the pharmacist to also make sure that all of the drug logs, everything is done properly, right? Because you don't want any temperature excursions on the drug if the drug is temperature sensitive, right? So you have all these different roles, and there's a lot more that deal directly with the patients and that support the clinical research on the site side. So that's over here. And we will go into another presentation on exactly what a research coordinator does. And then we will also go into a whole bunch of things on what a CRA does. So we'll have two separate future presentations coming up. And I believe next week we will talk about the CRA role. So I'll just touch on it a little bit. Now, going over to the sponsor side, and again, there can be aspects of this that is delegated out to the CRO, but a lot of this is usually on the sponsor side. So you have the medical officer, which you can usually think of as kind of a counter to the principal investigator. And sometimes you have a whole bunch of what we call clinical scientists who are under the medical officer, who are in charge of making sure that everything is done properly in the study, especially from a safety standpoint, and like from the design of the study and the protocol. That usually kind of all comes together. So you have the medical writer is kind of linked in together. A lot of times the department where these people work is called clinical science. So they're scientists, as in doctors, but they could also be PhD or just people who are there to support, like the medical writers who have experience in this. And basically, they are doing the overall kind of design of the study from a safety standpoint, looking at how do we think we can actually take this drug that we like and make sure that it's going to turn out safely for the patient, but then also show us that it's actually going to be effective, right? So that I like to think of clinical research as kind of usually weighing those two aspects. You want the drug to be effective and you want it to be safe, right? If you give somebody a really, really strong anti-cancer drug, it might kill the cancer, but it might also kill the patient, right? So that's when you have too much efficacy and not enough safety. And so you kind of slowly figure out where exactly you want to be in those two. And so that's the medical officer and kind of the medical team. A lot of times they will liaison with the principal investigators. You sometimes have a role called an MFL, which is usually like underneath the medical officer. Again, it matters how big the study and the company is. There could just be one running everything. Usually there's multiple people that are supporting the study from a medical standpoint. So if the investigator has questions, a lot of times they will turn to the medical officer or the clinical safety team to say, hey, I've noticed that these people are having this kind of reaction, or before the protocol actually gets enacted, when they're like reviewing the protocol, they might say, I don't think this is going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And so the medical officer is supposed to think about that and make sure that the protocol is well designed. The clinical trial assistant, and I don't know if we have it here on this list, but then what I think of kind of the partnering is you have a CTA, which can either be an assistant or an associate. And a lot of times you think about those are two levels. And then you have a CTM. That's the traditional hierarchy. So a CTA and a CTM. Like I said, you can have multiple CTAs on a study. You can have multiple CTMs on the study. Sometimes you'll have a senior CTM or somebody who's more of a clinical operations lead. That's my role. And basically, so you can have different titles within this. Sometimes a clinical trial specialist is somebody above a clinical trial associate, but below a CTM. And now there are a couple companies that do like kind of junior CTM roles. And I think it's clinical trial management associate. So it's like a CTMA. I only know of one company that does that, but they're trying to break into different levels and get people the transition to go in between these different levels on running the study. So your CTA has a very supportive function that can sometimes also be like a clinical trial administrator. So sometimes you have almost like an admin below and then the CTA. A lot of what they do has to do with the TMF, which we've talked about extensively, all of the documents that are going on within the study, and making sure everything is organized. And another aspect that they might do is tracking different patients, using a lot of the systems. So there's a system called the CTMS, which we'll have a separate presentation by Melanie on that in the future, hopefully in March. And there's all these different systems that are used to run the clinical trial. And a lot of times the CTA will kind of be in charge of the systems, making sure data is correctly going in there, pulling reports, making sure people are informed. And one of those systems is like the eTMF. So that's kind of the preview of the clinical trial assistant role. Now, the CRA is the same thing as a study monitor. And those are really important to understand kind of their role in general. And we'll go into next week, we'll do a presentation on the CRA. But basically, the CRA goes out to the site. So they're kind of this middleman in between the sponsor and the CTA, or the sponsor and the site. They go out, they are trying to make sure that the patients are healthy, everything's fine. From a compliance standpoint of, are they following the protocol? Like we mentioned, they work with the pharmacist to make sure drugs being dispersed. What are the temperature logs? Is drugs safely being kept at the site? So that's another way they control and support the safety of the patients, but they're not the doctors that are seeing the patients, right? They are from the sponsor going out and they're kind of just checking everything. So they have a large role in clinical research. You can't really do research without a CRA. So you can have a CTM that maybe goes out and visits sites too. But in general, I have yet to really see a study run without a CRA. Now, a lot of these other positions are very supportive, and there's different aspects of it. So the clinical data coordinator, that could be part of the CTA, in the sense that they are entering in and cleaning up all the data. Now, the clinical research coordinator role also usually does a lot of data entry on the site side. So sometimes there might be a clinical data coordinator at the site, and they're usually a similar role to the CRC. And then, yeah, they don't have to deal with patients directly, but they could if they were doing both roles. Yeah, so all of these are the safety scientist, the biostatistician. What we talked about, the CTM, the study manager, is up here kind of with the CTA. But then the data coordinator the quality assurance specialist, clinical business analyst, medical writer, and then some of that are not on this list are like the regulatory person on both the site and the sponsor. And that those are another important role that is being entered in kind of a large portion of the study. So maybe we'll touch base on that real quick. So we'll have a presentation later on this, but regulatory is the person who is in charge of filing all of the items with the whatever regulatory committee you have. And in our case, in the US, it's the FDA, right? In Europe, it's the EMA. So regulatory goes in and makes sure that all the documents are properly done and registered. So you do it at the beginning, you file for like an app, you file to start the study, and then a lot of times you file at the end of the study. And when you file at the end of the study, that usually prompts like an audit or an inspection from the FDA or whatever regulatory board or body committee that you have to come in and make sure that they agree. And usually they will look at your data. Again, was your drug safe and was it effective? If it doesn't really do anything, then usually a lot of times there's no reason to let you sell this drug because it doesn't provide any benefit. So you have to prove that you're making things better. You can't usually just make the same thing again and again. Or you can't just take other people's stuff. You have to show some improvement, and sometimes it means, oh, they take less pills, or there's less heartburn, or whatever, there's less side effects from our drug versus a competitor drug. But so the regulatory is in charge of a lot of the documentation. So if you're somebody who is entering in TMF and you started clinical research there, you can transition into regulatory because it's a good way to sidestep into that role, in the sense that it's also very high on documentation and like really carefully looking through everything. The quality assurance specialist is also kind of something similar. As I mentioned, the inspection and the audit that would come from the FDA. A lot of times the sponsor has their own quality assurance specialist who will play that role in making sure that the study is ready for an inspection. And so that's kind of a little overview of all the different positions. I know I went out of order, but I kind of wanted to go through and try to show how they interconnect. And this gives you an idea of where you might want to have your future career go, in the sense of you can enter clinical research at a lot of different points, and then you can develop knowledge, and then you can continue to move around into different things. So you can go from clinical operations, which is usually in here in terms of like your CTA and the CTM, right? When we have the study manager down here, but that's the operations, and then you have clinical science. We talked about drug in terms of the pharmacist, but you also have sometimes clinical supply chain, which is another similar role, kind of equal role to the CTA, in the sense of it can be fairly entry level, and then you rise up. There, people are in charge of sending out the drug, and then remember the pharmacist receives the drug and disperses it to the patient. PRA comes and checks and makes sure that all worked out and everything was good. So most of these positions all overlap with each other. And yeah, and so that's a little overview of everything. And then I will go through and try to have different people come in and present on different items. We just had Sonia present on protocols and like study design, and that's kind of an operation standpoint. But again, the medical monitor or the medical officer, the medical lead, is the one that's kind of designing the clinical protocol with the operations person. And then we actually have a friend who's doing a lot of like medical writing, so maybe I'll have her come in. We should have Kate coming in, who's going to give us a presentation on her experience at UCSF on clinical research coordinators. Next week, Jesse and potentially I will give an overview on the monitor's role, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into what they're looking for. And we have had some presentations. I believe Nick went over a clinical trial assistant role. And so if you're interested in these different things, let me know, and I can definitely see who I can find to come and talk to us about this. So you get a better understanding of where these positions fit in with each other and what you might be interested in your career. So thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. And I hope you've enjoyed this so far. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.